Welcome, welcome, everyone. Sit down and have a seat. I have been asked to do more Missing 411 videos, and since they are more time-consuming to get together, I haven't done as many as I should. I know they're my most popular. So, I have got one for you today. Again, I still favor the Fae Theory, following string theory and multiple universes and extra dimensions in said universes, that this is where these creatures come from. They have come from for millennia unknown, and hence our less scientific ancestors have dubbed them supernatural entities, such as the Fae, yokai, various names throughout the world. I have covered the string theory on another video. I will try and put the link down below if I remember. This also could cover the UFO theory, provided the UFOs come dimensionally and not across the vast wastelands of space, which is all in all probably more probable and practical if you think about it. So here we go. I'm starting with an article on Whitley Strieber's Unknown Country. If you don't know who Whitley Strieber is, or you've heard the name and you can't quite place it, he was first known for writing a book about his own UFO abduction, which, whether you believe it or not, is a terrifying book. He is well known in the supernatural, I want to say pundit, but that's not really the right word. Or maybe it is in an odd way. But the culture of the preternatural, Troy, I'm using that for you, preternatural, supernatural world. He's been on Coast to Coast several times as a host. He covers quite a lot of things. What you believe or don't believe, of course, is up to you. I found an article on his website from May of 2010 talking about disappearances in Indonesia. So, an unknowncountry.com reader, Alan Lammers, works on the island of Sulawesi in Indonesia, reports that many people are disappearing in the jungle, apparently due to very unusual form of abduction that takes place if they wear certain colors. Some are returned, but generally with no memory of what happened to them. His report follows. I am on an island called Sulawesi in Indonesia. To be exact, I am writing this from the city of Makassar, also known as Ujung Pandang Sulawesi Selatan, South Sulawesi, and my apologies for pronouncing probably all of that wrong. I started running across this story about 3 years ago when I went to a small village in the district of Sandu Batu in South Sulawesi. I was told not to bring any clothing with yellow in it or any other bright colors to wear in the jungle, only black or white. Black was most preferred. I had to ask why. They said that people who wear these bright colors will disappear. I thought it was some kind of cultural taboo that had a harsh punishment if broken, so I complied, of course. We got to the village and everyone wore black. The villagers verified that people do indeed disappear, but this village would not say why. When we got there, rested, met with the leaders of the village, about 10 of us proceeded to go into the jungle to witness illegal logging that was occurring there. and the villagers wanted to show us the damage. One of my friends, who is a Bugis Maskar, didn't listen or understand the warning and wore yellow socks. We did our tour and returned. He was strangely quiet. That night he became extremely ill. I had never seen a person projectile vomit that hard. He had an extreme fever also. We nursed him, and about a day later he returned to his healthy self. Then he told us what happened. He said something had bitten him on his right leg calf, and then his thigh. He showed us the marks. They were huge scratches. He said he could not see what was attacking him. He says he did not want to tell us what happened because he was embarrassed. The villagers stood around us with these knowing looks while we looked at the marks. I asked them what it was. They didn't want to say, but they said he was very lucky. Usually people disappear. I was stunned. It was not a taboo. It was a serious threat. I came back from the city of Palapo last night. I went there to visit a friend. Then I heard this story from her. Her cousin and 4 others went for a 3-day hike in the mountains, about an hour out of town. When they did not return, she began to worry. After about a week, things got very serious. She hired a search party with her own money. You have to understand she is poor, so the cost to her was enormous. I know it was a few months ago because she would send me notes apologizing for not having the money to pay me her monthly loan payment. I found out it was because of the search party. Anyway, I digress. She spent a month in the mountains searching for her cousin and his friends. They only found her brother. He was severely emaciated but still alive. He was also traumatized. He was also alone. The families of the missing men forced her and her family to continue searching for the 4 missing people. They have never been found. Not a trace, not even a body. They just disappeared. The brother has no memory as to what happened. He does not know how they got separated. He was so traumatized by what happened. He did not speak for 2 months. I questioned him a bit, but I stopped for now because he was returning to his previous state. I asked my friend what she thought happened. She said it was the jinn. Jinn is Arabic for demon. She said that many people have disappeared in the mountains because of jinn. I asked my engineer friend, who I worked with, about this earlier today. He said it happens often and reminded me of Walla Walla, the village we had gone to. Entire cultures have developed around this problem. They wear only black because they believe this allows them to travel through the jungle undetected by whatever it is that takes these people. At first I thought perhaps it was a python. The largest snake ever caught was python. It was caught in Sulawesi. I was immediately corrected. Snakes are not a problem. 2 grown adults, they said. That theory died on the spot. There is something taking these people, Whitley. Something terrible and evil in Sulawesi. The people of Sulawesi have come to terms with it and have tried to adapt themselves to deal with whatever it is. It has gone on long enough to bend culture. I will continue to investigate what this is. It is one of the strangest and most dangerous true stories I have ever come across. Could it be extraterrestrials? Maybe, but who knows? It would be easy for extraterrestrials to hunt human beings here because villages are so remote. I go by foot to many of them. There are few roads in some areas. Also, 85% are Muslim, and therefore people are not allowed to talk about this sort of thing. And the religion treats this circumstance as nonsense because it does not fit into doctrine and is in constant competition with animism. People are embarrassed to talk about it. This is a wild world, Whitley. Indonesia is one of the most volatile geographic areas in the world. The energy produced allows all sorts of entities to exist. Spirits are rampant here because of this. Their word for spirit is hantu. I have experienced hantu many times while here in Indonesia, but that's another story. Our correspondent provides the follow-up to his continuing investigation. After a bit of talk with some people who get the young man who had survived the hike into the jungle, I interviewed and recorded the information as best I could. I found out he kept seeing what the Bugis call Jin Kurkaki, meaning little demon people. These things do what is called penkulankan, or abduction. No one knows why they do this, but sometimes the people come back after a bit. The people, or creatures, who do this have a small nose, and their eyes are small and black, but their mouths are very broad, and when they smile, it is very large compared to the rest of their face. He could not remember the color of their skin. I asked for a picture to be drawn. He managed a crude, happy face, with a nose consisting of a single line and a huge grimace. The boy was the only one who could see them out of the 5. He kept seeing a lot of them, but when he would try to show the others, only one of the 4 who disappeared could see them. He also saw a strange animal he could not recognize. These animals are the size of a horse with huge antlers. He says he saw herds of them. He could not understand where they came from or why there were so many. They are not an animal indigenous to the area. There's no such known animal that big in Sulawesi. Apparently, this is a widespread problem. The reason why I say I recorded the conversation as best I could, what I mean is the batteries in the recorder, which were just changed before I arrived, went dead during the interview. This has happened before to me, so I did the battery in my keyboard, which was also new. I'll be going home in a week, but I'm stopping in Java first to see if this anomaly is occurring there. I keep getting told it happens a lot. I mean, a lot. I did a search, orang hilang, or disappearing person, and a lot of stories showed up. But the stories are in Bahasa. I plan on translating as many as I can because I have first-hand experience. Unknown Country will continue to follow this story and provide updates. Anyway, and I will leave the link to Mr. Strieber's unknowncountry.com, this article. From Indonesia, we will go to Japan. There is a book by Carmen Blacker. She is from Cambridge University, and she did her Japanese folklore is her thing, and she did a book on supernatural abductions, or rather a chapter on it. And there are a great many examples that these things happened. Here's the first one that she brings up. On the evening of September 30th, 1907, a child in the village in Aichi Prefecture disappeared just as everyone was busy preparing the white rice cakes to be offered to the god at a festival the next day. When the celebrations were over and the child still found to be missing, a frantic search was made throughout the village. For some hours, all efforts proved fruitless. Then suddenly, a loud thump was heard on the ceiling of the child's own house. They climbed up to see what had caused the noise, and found the child stretched out unconscious, his mouth covered with white rice cake. When at length he recovered his senses, he told them that he had been standing under the big cedar tree in the shrine precincts when a stranger had appeared and taken him away. They had walked over treetops and gone into many people's houses, where always there was a delicious feast of white rice cakes to eat. Eventually, he had felt himself thrust into a narrow place, which turned out to be the ceiling of his own house. The child afterwards became an idiot. A similar episode occurred near Kanazawa in 1877. A young man of about 20 suddenly disappeared, leaving his wooden sandals under a persimmon tree. All efforts to find him proved fruitless, until again there was a loud thump on the ceiling, and there, in the same cramped space, lay the young man with his mouth all green as though he had been eating leaves. He too, on recovering consciousness, told the tale of an old man who had carried him off and taken him to many distant places. Another story from Kumano district relates how on the night of the 19th of the 5th month of the year, 1808, a boy went out to the lavatory and did not return. They searched everywhere in vain until the small hours of the morning. He was discovered standing on the eaves of the go-down, his top hair cut off and his clothes covered with cobwebs and ears of Suzuki grass. For 3 days he slept soundly. Then he woke up and told how a mountain asket had appeared, taken him by the hand, and flown up into the sky. They'd flown a great distance at incredible speed, alighting now and then on various holy mountains, which he described accurately. He was enjoying himself very much and would have liked to see more places, but was worried about his family at home and begged to go back. From Kurama, they had come home in one leap, and he had found himself standing on the eaves of the go-down with the lanterns of the search party flashing below. If the child does not come back within the required time in response to the spells and the noise on the bells and drums, his relations must look for signs which will indicate he has indeed been stolen by a god, and not simply lost or drowned. In Shinshu province, a sure sign that he has been stolen is to find his shoes neatly placed together under a tree. In nearly all districts, a further proof of supernatural kidnapping is that he should be seen again briefly and mysteriously once. Again, that correlates to one of Pilates' criteria is the shoes and socks removed. Okay, back to Carmen's story. A child of 5 in a village in Bungo province cried so persistently and exasperatingly one night that his parents turned him out of doors as punishment. They heard his cries grow fainter and fainter in the direction of the mountains, until in alarm they rushed out to bring him back, only to find that he had completely disappeared. Spells, drums, and bells were all of no avail. Nothing more was seen or heard of him for 10 years. Then a man called Shoichi happened to be walking in the mountains not far from the village. Suddenly, he saw a frightful figure, 7 or 8 feet high and covered all over with fur. Too terrified to move, he watched it draw nearer and nearer until unexpectedly it inquired in a human voice where he came from. Shoichi told him the name of his village. "That is my old home," it said. "Do you remember hearing of a child lost many years ago? I was that child." It gave Shoichi a cake made of chestnuts and climbed up the sheer face of the rock as lightly and nimbly as a bird. It was never seen again. Well, now, that is interesting. Looking at it from a global perspective, maybe these missing children turn into Sasquatch, if this is to be believed. Women as well as boys are apt to fall victim to kamigakushi, which is stolen by the gods. And they may reappear mysteriously once also. A girl from a well-to-do family in Iwate Prefecture was riding to her bridegroom's house on her wedding day. She seemed to be taking a long time to cover the short distance, so they went to see whether she had met with an accident. They found only a riderless horse. The girl had completely vanished. Some months later, on a winter's evening, some villagers were chatting in a shop, when suddenly a girl came in and asked for some sake. To their astonishment, they recognized the missing bride. But before they could speak to her, she had paid for the sake and gone. They rushed out, but she was nowhere to be seen. Of the fate of this girl we are left to guess, but of another stolen girl who lived as late as the mid-19th century, there came strange and unexpected tidings. She had gone up to the mountainside to gather chestnuts and had not returned. Her parents concluded her to be dead, had her funeral obsequies performed, but a couple of years later a hunter suddenly met her on the slopes of a mountain called Goyazan. She told him that she had been carried off by a terrifying creature and had been living with him and his wife ever since. She was never given a chance to escape, and indeed any minute now he might come back. He was not unlike an ordinary man in appearance, except that his eyes were a terrible color, and he was immensely tall. She had several children by him, but always he had declared that because they did not resemble him, they could not be his. In a rage, he had taken them all away and presumably killed them. The hunter took her by the hand and began to hurry down the mountainside. They were just approaching the village when suddenly a fearfully tall man bound after them through the woods, seized the girl and carried her off. She was never seen again. Who are these mysterious kidnappers? They are clearly of several kinds, some much more dangerous than others. The old men in the first example we quoted were undoubtedly manifestations of the local Shinto deity, who had temporarily borrowed the boys as mediums for receiving the offerings of rice cakes laid out for them at the festival. The tall, hairy creatures, on the other hand, from whose clutches it seems difficult if not impossible to escape, were Yama Otako, or mountain men. These mysterious, semi-human denizens of the mountain, the belief in whom some Japanese folklorists think may have originated in an ancient and unfamiliar race of mountain people, are described fairly uniformly by woodcutters of varying districts. They are very tall, with glittering eyes and long hair straggling down to their shoulders. Sometimes they are covered with leaves or tree bark instead of fur. These creatures, it will be noted, never take the child on entertaining journeys to strange lands and mountain. They carry it straight back to their lair in the mountains, where they're keeping it in strict durance as a servant or catamite. Women, it will also be noted, are kidnapped only by Yamatoko, and for the sole purpose of becoming the wives of the creatures. They are never taken on magical journeys. Nope, women never get that wonderful experience. Yeah. Boy, even the folklore, no, we won't go there. The most subtle and fearful of all the supernatural kidnappers, however, is exemplified by the mountain ascetic in our third story. The figure was clearly a disguised tengu. These creatures, with the wings and beaks of a kite, tiger's claws, and oddly glimmering eyes, were believed to haunt most of the high mountains of Japan. In medieval literature, they appear prominently as one of the most sinister enemies of Buddhism. Some more Kamigakushi stories are from more Japanese literature. This one is from Shosei Kishu, a 19th century collection of stories compiled by a priest called Mushu. A boy disappeared from a monastery in the mountains. After a couple of days, they found him on the temple roof in a state of stupefaction. When they recited a dharani over him, he recovered his senses and told them he'd been lured away by some Yamabushi who had taken him to a temple in the mountains called Anrakuji. A venerable priest of over 80, who seemed to be the chief of the company, called the child over and said, "These fellows are a worthless lot. Just stay here and watch what happens to them." The child watched them as they danced, when something like a net descended from the sky and seemed to draw itself round the dancers. The Yamabushi, in great distress, did their best to escape, but in vain. From the meshes of the net shot forth flames which grew gradually fiercer until the Yamabushi were burnt to ashes. After a while, they appeared again as Yamabushi, just as before, and started to dance. The old priest said to one of them, "Why did you bring this child here? Take him back to his temple at once." Whereupon the Yamabushi looked very much afraid and took the boy back. Boy, that sounds like a modern weapon, but them coming back. Another one from the 18th century collection, Keiden Toshioko. A little peasant boy set out on an errand from his mother's house in the Sanuki province. Soon he was seen to leave the path and run through the fields of standing wheat. "What are you doing?" they shouted angrily at him. "Trampling down our wheat like that." The boy simply went on running and eventually disappeared. When he did not come back, they began to be alarmed and told his mother what they had seen. The poor woman was beside herself with anxiety, and to comfort her, the whole village turned out every night, banging on drums and bells, calling, "Come back, come back." But when, after several days, there was still no sign of the boy, the villagers grew tired and gave up. Then suddenly he was discovered standing on the altar of the Canon Hall of the Kokubunji temple nearby. In great excitement, they lifted him down and took him home, and for 4 or 5 days he lay speechless and unconscious. When he came to himself, everybody asked what he had been doing, and when he was seen running through the wheat. 2 Yamabushi had come, he said, seized him by the hand, and run with him until he was out of breath. They had taken him to many places, until at last they had come to rest on the top of Mount Yakuragitaiki. There they had stayed until 3 more Yamabushi arrived. One sang, another played on the samisen, while the third tossed him about in the air, as though he were a ball. Just then an old priest in a gray robe appeared and said, "Don't do that. Let me have the child." At first the Yamabushi took no notice, but eventually, as the old man continued to ask for the boy, they gave him up. After that, the boy remembered nothing until he woke up to see the villagers gathered around him. All of this happened quite recently, the story ends, and the people concerned are still alive. So it must be true. And the last example she gives is from Kokon Yomiko from 1821. In the year of 1740, some repairs were being carried out to the western tower of the Hall of Shaka on Mount Hai, with 2 officials in charge of the work. Among the retainers of these officers was a man of about 30, by the name of Kuichi Haiziamon. In the early evening of the 7th day of the 3rd month, this man suddenly disappeared without a trace. Searching for him high and low, they found, scattered in odd places in the temple garden, his wooden sandals, his short sword bent like a pothook, with its scabbard smashed, and his undersash cut into 3 pieces. Realizing it must be the work of a Tengu, they continued their search, ordering prayers and spells to be recited in all the temples and haunted spots on the mountain. That night at 2 a.m. there was a sound like the blast of a mighty wind, and a voice was heard calling, "Tanamo, Tanamo." Rain was falling heavily, and the mountain was still deep in snow, so that little could be seen outside. But a man called Suzuki Shichiro followed the voice, ventured into the garden, and saw standing on the roof of the temple a strange winged figure. "Help! Help me down!" it cried. "Are you not Haizeamon?" Shichiro asked. "Yes," replied the figure. Shichiro then saw that what had seemed to be wings attached to the figure was in fact the broken frame of an open umbrella. A crowd began to gather, and at last a workman called Shiro Fae climbed up on the roof to help the man down. Haizeamon at once fainted, so that Shirobel had to strap him to his back with a sash and crawl down on his stomach. For 3 days, Haizeamon laid unconscious. When at last he came to his senses, he told them that about 3 o'clock in the morning he had heard a voice calling his name. He had gone outside to look, and there, at the entrance of the temple, was a small priest, wearing wide trousers and a black robe tucked up short. As Haizeamon approached, he was joined by other men with a red face and wild black hair, wearing ceremonial dress. "Come up to the roof," they ordered him. Haizeamon laid his hand on his sword, but at once the 2 strange figures seized him, and in an ensuing struggle his sword was bent like a pothook, and its scabbard smashed. "Take off your sash," they then cried, and when Haizeamon refused, they tore it off him and cut it into 3 pieces. Then they dragged him up to the roof and were beating him hard with a big stick, when a tall priest in a red robe appeared and shouted angrily, "Stop!" They whispered something together, and then the first 2 strangers said, "You must come with us." Thinking that it would be the worst for him if he refused, Haizeamon did as was told and stepped into a thing like a round dish. The small priest pressed down on his shoulders with both hands, and he felt himself rise up in the air. We flew on and on over the sea. Haizeamon continued, "I was very frightened, but the tall priest appeared to me and said, 'If you say water cannot drown me, you need have no fear.' I shut my eyes, but even so I could see the sea below. At last we arrived at the top of what seemed to be Mount Akiba. In the valley, far down below, a great fire was raging. I was terrified lest I should be thrown down the mountainside and burnt. But the tall priest appeared again and said, 'Say, fire cannot burn me, and you will have no fear.' I shut my eyes, and we flew on again, past Myogasan and Hikosan and many other mountains. I thought about 10 days must have passed and begged them to take me back. A white-haired man came forward and said, 'In that case, we must give you some money.' And he produced many gold coins, telling me that however many were spent, the store would never be exhausted. But before I could take them, the tall priest said to me, 'If you accept this money, 2 of your aunts will have their lives shortened by 1 year each.' So I replied, 'Thank you, but I cannot accept these coins, as it would be a pity to shorten my aunts' lives.' The stranger said, 'What a queer fellow you are. In that case, we will give you a prescription and a discipline which will enable you to live the rest of your life in peace. One of the herbs for the prescription grows only on this mountain. When you want to make it up, just climb the mountain, and we will give it to you.' With these words, they gave me a slip of paper with the formula written on it. 'You must never tell anyone of this,' they continued. 'For 3 years you must purify your mind and body with a strict discipline. Take particular care to avoid the contamination of women.' Oh, sure, we're the contamination. 'After 3 years you can lie with your wife without ill effects.' That's a long time. But when you wish to make up the medicine, you must observe the discipline strictly. We are sending you back now.' In the small hours of the morning, I felt myself coming down on what seemed to be a mountaintop, then landing on the roof of the temple. The strangers had disappeared, but I heard the voice of the tall priest echoing among the mountain streams. I asked him who he was, and he replied, 'I have lived on this mountain for 900 years, which is not an answer.' Then, just as the workman Shirobi climbed up to rescue me, the priest disappeared and I lost consciousness. Harada concluded the story with the remark that it must certainly be true because it was recorded by someone who had seen it all with their own eyes. And nobody tells fish stories. Anyway, there is some very interesting stories for you they definitely serve a pattern and probably more likely mirror alien abduction than Fae. Although, if you consider them to be two sides of the same coin, you can see both there. I now have some supernatural disappearances to read that go back farther than the Japanese stories that we've shared. Yeah, this is in the West. We will start with Gil Perez, which comes from 1593. This comes from a website called anomalyinfo.com. Gil Perez, the out-of-place soldier. It was October 25th, 1593, when he was first noticed, an unknown Spanish soldier standing at guard duty in front of the Viceroy's castle in Mexico City, Mexico. Though he clearly knew how to do the job, he still stood out, for he was wearing the wrong uniform. The strange soldier's uniform was soon identified as the proper one for the guards on duty in the Spanish colony of Manila in the Philippines. And not surprisingly, the captain of the guard was called in to sort out the matter. The soldier explained that he was Gil Perez and that he was following his orders as far as he was able. He had been told to guard the palace, so he was guarding the palace. It just wasn't the palace he would normally have found himself in front of. He was indeed from the Philippines, as of just earlier in the day. And furthermore, he told the captain of the guard that the governor of Manila, Gomez Perez Dascamarinas, had been killed the night before by a Chinese mutiny aboard one of the Spanish ships. This was all clearly a bold fabrication, simply because the Philippines were over 8,000 miles away across the Pacific Ocean. Yet Perez stuck to his story. So the captain of the guard passed the news on to the Viceroy, who next interviewed the out-of-place soldier. And still Perez stuck to his unbelievable account. Perez did prove he had accurate knowledge of the known current affairs in the Philippines, as he had been brought to the Viceroy by ship, and he knew all about the regiment he claimed to belong to. As previous soldiers from the Philippines attested, the only thing that gave the soldier pause was trying to explain how he could have traveled between the Philippines and Mexico just that morning. But Perez himself had no good explanation, noting that half an hour earlier he was in Manila and now he was here. And that was all he could say about that. Under the circumstances, the Viceroy felt that either Perez was a liar or he was working for the devil, especially if he had actually somehow come from Manila that morning. Until word could be gotten from Manila as to which of the circumstances was correct, Perez was put in jail. Months later, answers arrived from sea. A galleon from the Philippines not only confirmed Perez's account of the death of the governor, Gomez Perez Dascamarinas, but also provided a military officer who recognized Perez as one of the military guards who had specifically gone missing about the same time. And he was surprised to find him in Mexico City. To say this all astounded the Viceroy, among others, would be an understatement, but not so much that the Viceroy didn't know what to do. Perez was put on the returning vessel headed back to Manila, and all others involved tried to forget the whole thing happened as best they could. The odd fact of the occurrence, however, was recorded in 1609 by none other than Dr. Antonio de Morga. At least two researchers, Jose Rizal and Morris K. Jessup, have asserted, placing the story in the right place at the right time, and in the words of impeachable recorder of Spanish history. That is an interesting story I had never heard of before. It goes on to pick up to discuss it further, but I think I will leave it to your discretion of what to think of it. We'll skip ahead to 1678 and Dr. Moore and the fairies. The legend. In 1678, a pamphlet was published in London titled Strange and Wonderful News from the Country of Wicklow in Ireland, or A Full and True Relation of What Happened to One Dr. Moore. And here's what the pamphlet claimed happened. Early in 1678, a schoolmaster from London named Dr. Moore was sitting in an inn by Drumgary near Baltinglass in the county of Wicklow, Ireland, with his friends Richard Uniacke and Lachlan Moore. They had traveled to Wicklow together because Dr. Moore had bought an estate in said county and wanted to check it out. As they sat and chatted, Dr. Moore talked about how he had been a child in the very area they were in now, though it had been around 34 years since he'd last visited. Dr. Moore stated that he had often been told by his mother and other relations that spirits, known as fairies, used to frequently carry him away. On these occasions, he said, they would ask an old woman of the area to call him back from the fairies by using some spells she knew. Mr. Uniacke argued with Dr. Moore that he should put aside any beliefs he had in such an improbable story, but Dr. Moore would not be swayed from what he felt was true. The dispute ended suddenly as Dr. Moore stood up and told him he must leave their company, for he was being called away. Without a cell phone or anything else, obviously. It was when Mr. Uniacke discovered, most disturbingly, that Dr. Moore was slowly raising off the ground, and Uniacke immediately grabbed the doctor by the arm and shoulder. Lachlan Moore quickly took a similar grip of Dr. Moore's other arm, but the doctor was still lifted up completely into the air. Lachlan let go out of fear, but Uniacke held on until he himself was lifted a full yard above the ground, and an unseen power forced him to let go also. The doctor then vanished from the room, but in the confusion caused by the situation, no one noticed exactly how. Uniacke and Lachlan called for the innkeeper immediately, but when they told him the story, he acted as if it was nothing unusual. He told them that a quarter of a mile away was a wise woman who helped people find things that had been lost, such as when their cattle strayed, and the innkeeper was sure she could help find their friend. A messenger was sent, and when she arrived, Mr. Uniacke demanded to know if she could tell them anything of the fate of their friend, Dr. Moore. She said she could, and that Moore was currently in a wood about a mile away, preparing to ride a horse. He also currently had a glass of wine and a piece of bread he planned to consume, but that if he did, he would never be free from consumption and pine away to death. Uniacke paid the woman a cob, it has a question mark here because who knows what that means, and asked her to stop Moore from having the food if she could. She said she could, and then struck down her hand as if she were grabbing something. After this odd action, she repeated a spell in Irish multiple times to call him back to his friends. She then told Uniacke and Lachlan that Dr. Moore would that night travel from the woods to a Dane's fort about 7 miles away, where there would be great reveling and dancing, and plenty of tempting food and drink, which she would prevent him from having. After the fort, he would travel another 20 miles to another such festivity, and then to the 7 churches, and finally, towards daybreak, he would be returned safe and sound to his friends. Having stated such, the woman left, and Uniacke and Lachlan waited for dawn. Sure enough, around 6 in the morning, Dr. Moore knocked at the door to the inn. First, he had breakfast, for he had been rushed back and forth all night with nothing to eat. Feeling better after that, he then described to his friends where and what he had felt he'd done that night. He described how he had seen about 20 men, some on horseback, enter the room they were in the night before, and had taken hold of the doctor. Dr. Moore was aware that Uniacke and Lachlan had tried to hold him, but no matter what their strength, they would not have been able to resist the host that had come to take him away. Next, Dr. Moore had been carried to the woods about a mile away, where he found a fine horse prepared for him and was generously given wine and bread. But when he tried to have some, they were both inexplicably struck from his hands. He had spent the night traveling with the company that had taken him from the inn, riding a white horse whose motion was exceedingly swift. They first visited a Dane fort about 7 miles distant, and then the 20 or so men multiplied to a company of 300 men and women, with one on a sorrel horse who seemed to be the chief. Everyone dismounted and began dancing, which the doctor had a turn to lead, and remembered well the tune they had danced to. After the dance, a great feast appeared, and he was led by the hand to the food, but still all food and drink was struck invisibly from his hands before he could have any. From there his adventure continued in exactly the fashion the old woman had predicted, and Dr. Moore found himself alone again at daybreak, standing in sight of the inn. Mr. Uniacke asked Dr. Moore to show him the Dane fort, and the doctor traced the entire path he had traveled the night before to the place. At the fort, Moore and Uniacke found the grass trodden down and ground beaten as if hundreds of people had been there recently. Mr. Uniacke was so impressed by the whole strange affair that he made a statement of it before Dr. Moore, Dr. Murphy, a civilian, the others not civilians? I don't know, and Mr. Ludlow, one of the 6 clerks in the High Court of Chancery, on November 18th, 1678. And it was from this statement that the facts were ascertained for the pamphlet. Anyway, that part is quite interesting. I do have more stories and information, my darlings, but I think I will leave this here. I hope you've enjoyed it. And thanks so much for watching. It means the world to me. Thank you once again, my darlings, for coming to see me in my little chateau. I don't get out much these days, as many of us don't. But it does mean the world to me. Why else would I be reading these stories, if not for you? Special thanks to my membership and Patreon supporters: Creepy Clown Girl, Unicorn Smoke, Ermin Case, Darren and Jennifer, Laura, Mutant Artificial Intelligence, Tabby Cat, and of course, Charlotte Emerson and Cortez Williams. You guys are amazing. Have a lovely day, my darlings.